talking about two different topics. One is what to look for in a buck when you're looking to purchase one. And then the second one is calculating out the costs for what it takes to raise goats when you're considering getting started. Good morning. I'm doing a live Q&A this morning, changing things up a little bit just because of schedules. But today I will be covering a couple topics related to raising meat goats. My name's Leslie and I own Cylon Rolling Acres in western Wisconsin. And I raise our goats on pasture, if you haven't been on here before for a while. But usually when I do live Q&As, I'll cover topics related to raising meat goats, anything related to marketing, and also grazing goats. And so today, this morning, I'm going to be talking about two different topics. One is what to look for in a buck when you're looking to purchase one. And then the second one is calculating out the costs for what it takes to raise goats when you're considering getting started. So the first question that I'll talk a little bit about today is what to look for in a buck. So in general, I would recommend when you're sourcing any livestock for your farm or your operation, whether you're getting started or whether you're adding to your herd, is to really look at, my preference is to look at how the farm that you're purchasing from or the ranch you're purchasing from, that they parallel with how you're raising your animals. So take a look at management practices. Are they raising them in a similar manner? It doesn't mean one way is right and one way is wrong, but you're going to have a lot more success with transitioning those animals to your herd if they're raised in a similar manner. Doesn't mean it's always going to be smooth sailing, but you'll have a lot more success. So for example, our goats are all raised on pasture, forage-based diet. Obviously they get hay in the winter because we're in Wisconsin. If we were to purchase an animal that has been heavily grained or more of a show animal, we're going to have more tough transition bringing them into our herd. And our animals probably aren't cut out to be show animals. So, I mean, there kind of goes both ways. So those are like two extreme examples. And so those are some very basic concepts, but I say that the similar management style is really the preference. In addition to your breed preference, I would say though, breed may not trump all. That might be an unpopular opinion, but keep that in mind for what your goals are. And the breed can play a role in it, obviously, but it isn't always, maybe the top decision factor. And I would also say too, another component to take a look at, people always ask, what about registered animals? I come from the camp that, probably registered animals who are registered to me it doesn't really mean anything to me. I'm really concerned about can they handle living in the environment that we raise our goats. I'm also interested in how their sire and dam have performed. So for example, their dam, their mother, do they have good mothering traits? Do they need have they needed much assistance on with kidding? How many kids do they typically deliver? Is it twins? Is it triplets? Does it tend to be singles? From the buck standpoint, and also the offspring of its mother, what kind of rate of gain have they seen in as an animal? For me, we're raising animals on pasture, so rate of gain on a forage-based diet is really important. So also asking about rate of gain. Those elements to me are more important than their pedigree. I know that can come into play, but that's the perspective that I'm taking and what's worked, well for us. So those are some factors to consider when you're looking at what buck might be a good fit for purchasing for your herd. A few other items I would say also would be asking about parasite management, and knowing that parasite management has to be a factor of consideration for pretty much any herd of goats. Just asking the owner who's selling the animal what their parasite management practices are, because then you'll get an idea of how much of an issue it is, and if there's a difference if you're deworming as needed, not at all, or on a very regular schedule. And so that kind of goes along with the management practices as well. But those are factors also to consider. Let's see here. The other place I would say is, I know I said the piece of looking at registered, it doesn't maybe matter as much. Depending on what you're looking at getting into, there can be some factors to take a look at if you're looking at maybe some specific breed characteristics. So, or strengths. So, for example, we are in the we raise pasture-based herd. So there are some research. We call it, pasture-based management herd tests that they do with bucks with just some different universities, and so there can be some performance standards even with certain lines of goats, and that can be a factor to take a look into if those animals have come from those lines, because then you have some very specific data that relates to rate of gain and parasite management as well. In terms of sourcing animals, the goat world unfortunately can be pretty disjointed. So there, when you're going to look for animals, obviously there's just a general search at Google, but not all farms have an online presence. But that can be a good start. You can look for breed associations to help you kind of narrow down, maybe finding specific farms or breeders in your region. Even just sometimes using social media to take a look at sourcing animals who are come from similar management practices. Again, there's kind of creative ways to take a look at it, but it can be a little tough being in the goat world because we don't have as many formal organizations as maybe other livestock breeds do. So it's a little harder to figure out who's raising animals and who might be in a good match situation that way. I would say in general with having a breeding buck, I would say, and of course every situation is different, but I know when we first got started, we were a little hesitant about having a buck on the farm, and I would say it's not as a big deal as what you might think. It could be. I know a lot of times there's a hesitation about having a buck, and I think we've had, most of them aren't too bad. We've had a couple that have been a little wild and do their own thing, but overall it's not as bad as what some people might think as they're getting into raising goats. So I'm going to move on to the second question that I'm covering today, and this is looking at what are the costs for getting started raising goats? And this one is a little, I admit, if you're getting started, you want to have an idea of what it's going to cost to get started, what you're going to put in to your operation, or even if you're just getting started with a few goats. And so I admit this one is a little bit more nebulous, but because it really, when it comes down to it, it really depends on a lot of factors in where you live in the world, or and at the point where we're in the United States, so it's how, where are you located can really factor this. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things to consider, and then resources that can help you with taking a look at those numbers. So, right out of the gate, how much do goats cost? You'll have to take a look at, I would say in general, in our area, non-registered show animals, $350 to $400 a head for breeding stock. That number may be a little bit higher now, just with the demand, but some of that kind of changes and ebbs and flows. A good place, a few places to look is actually talk to other farms or folks that raise goats in your area and ask what the kind of the general going rate is for breeding animals. And again, that will depend on if they're meat breeds, they're dairy breeds, commercial, which is basically I would say animals who are raised for their purpose, so for dairy or meat, versus the registered animals are going to have and show animals will have a higher price tag. So there's kind of some different windows there. Also, a few other options to get some general ideas, though they're not really my favorite, but it is a way to look at it. You can look on Craigslist to see what animals are listed for, though Craigslist isn't really a great representation, but it can give you a ballpark amount. Regional Facebook groups. So Facebook really is not doing a lot of, you're not supposed to be doing animal sales, but it could give you an idea, even in some groups related to raising goats, what are people seeing for rates for breeding animals in your area. Sales barns can be an option, though I would not recommend. Again, it gives you a general idea, though typically if people are selling herds or animals at a sales barn, they're looking to cull them and move them from their herd. So again, that maybe not necessarily sourcing, but it could give you a general ballpark of prices, though typically breeding animals are going to cost more than what you'd see at the sale barn, just because they have a longer life value and produce more offspring. But again, that can give you some pricing concepts. In terms of, I know there's some questions about cost for enclosures, so you don't necessarily have to have a barn for your animals if you're getting started, but you probably want to look at some type of enclosure, shelter for them. So a few things to look at if you're pricing it out. Just to get started, calf hutches can be an option. A three-sided barn, and sometimes those can actually be shelters that you can purchase kind of pre-manufactured. So again, those are some things to get you started to look at pricing for shelter. You'll have to take a look into consideration for cost for feed. Hay is a primary source for feed, so taking a look at feed costs in your area and getting an estimate of what it would take to feed the number of animals you want. Depending on the type of animal you're raising, you may or may not need to supplement with grain. Depending on your access to hay, sometimes people will supplement with grain because it's just easier to purchase that, but it's not necessarily needed depending on the quality of hay you have and also what your the nutrient needs of your goats. So for example, a goat that is in maintenance mode, which would be like a breeding buck, they're not growing, they're not pregnant, they're not lactating, so producing milk. They're going to have a lower standard threshold of nutrient requirement as compared to a doe that's pregnant or raising two kids by her side, nursing them. Milking goats obviously have more of a higher nutrition requirement. Young kids who are growing have a higher nutrition requirement. So those are some things to kind of keep in mind as you look at calculating out cost to feed. That one is a little tougher to kind of plan for, just because some of those expenses will change over time, but it gives you an idea as you start to look at planning. If you're the other piece to look at aside from feed is also minerals, and so looking at the cost for minerals. Typically, when you first start feeding minerals, depending on the herd's need or exposure use with minerals, sometimes they'll use more early on and then kind of taper off as their bodies get reforming, kind of say rebalanced with it. So mineral is going to be an expense to take a look at, and depending on the time of year in their feed quality, mineral may ebb and flow on their needs. So there's the expense of the goat itself, the shelter, the feed, and minerals at a very basic level. So a few other resources to take a look at when you're looking at those expenses. I would say look at the extension services in your area, or in your state or neighboring states, because some states have more resources related to small ruminants for goats. Even look at resources related to sheep. Unfortunately, there's more information out there for sheep than goats. So, and while they're different animals, they're somewhat comparable when you're looking at general management practices. Annie's Project is also another great resource for getting started. It's not in all states, but in a number of states it is helped. It's a program that helps that can help newer producers get off the ground and getting started. So they do a lot of the kind of groundwork and helping plan. So that could be a resource to take a look at. The Land Stewardship Project is based in Minnesota, but it has a little bit broader regional reach. And they have a Farms Dreams program that helps people who have aspirations or who are thinking about farming start to look at the planning process for what it might look like for farming. And then they have a Farm Beginnings program for folks who are just getting started. It's kind of the dreams part is the planning. The Farm Beginnings is kind of getting rolling. And I didn't participate in those programs, but I know a lot of farmers who have, or folks who are just getting started and have had great reviews on that program to really help get the ball rolling in planning your farm operation and really, kind of making it a reality or determining if it's something you really want to do or not. So I'd recommend those. And on a very basic level, it sounds kind of cheesy, but there is also, if you're just looking at like the basics of getting started, there is a book called Story's Guide to Raising Meat Goats. And that could be there's a lot more to learn from, than just that book, but it's a good kind of, I would say, foundation standpoint for getting your feet wet and figuring out like what you really need to get started. And then you can work from there on planning out what your budget looks like. So there you go. So topics today, we covered a little bit on how you choose a buck for your herd, and then also some factors to consider when you're getting started. So with our Q&As, I will have the archives posted on my blog, so the replay will be on there. You can always obviously watch it here on Instagram, but I'll include the replay on my blog along with show notes. So a lot of the resources I mentioned and some other supplemental information related to the content will be listed in my in the show notes on my blog on my website, Grazing with Leslie. And then if you don't catch this live, or you want to make sure you don't miss future Q&As or see my the archives, if you join my email list at Grazing with Leslie, you'll also get an email when we have new Q&As up. If you're interested in asking questions in the future, you can always comment below on this video, or find a link on my Grazing with Leslie page to submit a question. I've been doing these probably once or twice a month now that we're kind of getting the groove of school with my family, but I'll continue to do these just because I know that as a farmer who's gotten into raising goats, there's not a lot of resources out there, and I want to be able to share what we're doing and the resources we've been able to use to help us continue to progress as farmers who raise meat goats on pasture. So have a good morning, and I will see you in the future.